Yeah.
Thank you very much, George. Good morning, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. I've wanted to come to Alderney for some time, not least because until very recently I was the president of the Wildlife Trusts nationally, and was hoping to visit all of the Wildlife Trusts before I came to the end of my term of office, but I was terminated in my term of office through being appointed to be the chair of Natural England, so had to end prematurely my career as president of the Wildlife Trust. But I'm delighted to be here at this Wilder Islands conference and hopefully to share a few remarks with you that will be of interest in the context of what we're discussing. I have to say this place turned rather wilder last night after dinner. We walked back to the hotel and during the course of that 15-minute walk received more rainfall than the entire annual precipitation in Cambridge, and I think says something about the nature of such places. So today I'm just going to share a few personal reflections with you really about islands and their importance for wildlife and the wider environmental challenges that we face. And just to begin with a few observations about their uniqueness. And so the world's islands, many tens of thousands of them, hugely diverse in character, from those sitting in shallow water on continental shelves to those rising from volcanoes located in thousands of meters of water in the deep ocean, and each has its own particular character and each has its own particular set of biological characteristics. But it is that fact of isolation and time that has led to this incredible explosion of life that we still are lucky enough to observe today, and some of it is quite modest and quite low-key. In Natural England's patch we have some island endemics in the Bristol Channel, where we have the island of Lundy, where we have the Lundy cabbage, and dependent upon the Lundy cabbage we have the Lundy cabbage flea beetle and the Lundy cabbage weevil. Very interesting animals and plants, and of course across the globe we find diversity characterised by particular island environments that contribute hugely to global biodiversity. And it was islands, of course, that first helped to inspire the understanding of how life on this planet works. Perhaps the most famous textbook example of evolution in progress is the example of Darwin's finches. When Charles Darwin's beagle visited the Galapagos Islands in the 1830s, he observed these 14 species of birds that we now know are descended from the blue-black grass-quit finch of South America. A flock of those somehow had gotten 600 miles out into the Pacific Ocean, where they had undertaken a process of adaptive radiation, 14 species developing a range of different bill types, little brown sparrow birds, and Charles Darwin looked at them and said they had a common ancestor, including the vampire finch, which had evolved into feeding on the blood of incubating boobies, an incredible adaptation born of island conditions. I sometimes wonder, however, what Charles Darwin would have made of the Hawaiian Islands had he carried on sailing further out into the Pacific Ocean, because if he thought the Darwin's finches were interesting, he would have found that the Hawaiian honey creepers would have blown him away, because there were 57 of those, and those birds arrived at what is perhaps the most remote island outpost on planet Earth, with these islands soaring to emerge from the water 30,000 feet above the benthos from tall volcanoes. And these little birds, about 5 million years ago, somehow blew across the northern Pacific, probably from Asia, or found a flock that then evolved into 57 species, and in the process developing every songbird bill that we know from the rest of the world, including one which is unique, the iwiwi, a tiny little red bird with a D-curved bill for feeding on nectar. And this remoteness explains why 98% of Hawaii's birds, native birds, are found nowhere else on this planet. And so Charles Darwin's inspiration is seen across the planet in many famous examples of so-called island endemism, animals and plants that are confined to particular spots, making these places biologically very interesting. And across the world we find that Mauritius has some 50% of all of its higher plants, mammals, birds and reptiles are endemic Seychelles has the highest level of amphibian endemism anywhere on Earth. Cuba, the big island in the Caribbean, has 18 species of endemic mammal. If you look at the coastal countries of Guatemala and Honduras, they only have 3 each. Madagascar, home to more than 8,000 endemic species. And so this is the result, as I say, of isolation, and has led over time to some particular characteristics that we can attribute to island organisms, and some of them include gigantism. So there's giant tortoises you find on some islands, dwarfism, very small versions of things that are on continents, flightlessness, the lack of dispersibility, and the, over time, tendency to lose defence mechanisms. And of course, all of these things are taking place in groups of animals and plants that are in small populations and therefore with a limited genetic pool. And this is why island biodiversity is out of all proportion to the land area of islands on our planet, contributing to a range of hotspots that on 5% of the Earth's land have about a fifth of the planet's vascular plants and about 15% of all the air-breathing vertebrates species. And some of these islands, some of the larger ones in particular, are absolutely incredible biological treasures. The island of New Guinea, where on the mountain tops there are tropical glaciers going through montane forests into subtropical and tropical rainforests, coming down to shorelines that then grade into incredible tropical reefs with many thousands of endemic species. The island wildlife, however, is not only incredibly diverse and unique, it's also uniquely vulnerable. And of the more than 700 documented extinctions that have taken place over the last 500 years or so, would you believe 88% of the bird extinctions included in that were of island endemics, 54% of the amphibians amongst those extinctions, island endemics, and about 86% of the reptiles. So a very high proportion of the extinctions we've already recorded are down to these animals and plants that are located in these little outposts where they've uniquely evolved to be what we see today, or until what we recently saw. And it's not only those that are already extinct that are disproportionately associated with islands, but all those that could become extinct quite soon. So of the red-listed amphibians, about 1/5 are island endemics. Of the red-listed mammals, about 1/4, and of the birds, about 1/3. I've been working in conservation for many, many years and have been lucky enough to get involved with many different initiatives, including a period working at BirdLife International during the 1980s, where I became quite familiar with some of these island issues. And indeed, I remember on my first day arriving there in Cambridge, and colleagues just returned from Montserrat in the Caribbean to undertake a survey of the status of the Montserrat oriole, a bird with a tiny island endemic range, with much of its suitable habitat having recently been destroyed by a volcanic eruption. So that kind of underlined not only the extent to which we humans might be involved in the vulnerability of such creatures, but indeed how nature sometimes can play a role. My work, however, was to help save threatened parrot species. So of the world's 350 species of parrot, about 100 regarded as at some level of risk of global extinction, and it was many island endemics that were on my desk that we were looking to try and do something about, including the beautiful Amazon parrots of the New World. There's about 30 species of those across Central South America, 1 or 2 go up into Mexico, but it's in the islands of the Caribbean where we find this incredible radiation of species that's taken place over time. There's a unique species called the Cuban parrot, 2 subspecies on Cuba, 2 more in the Cayman Islands, and another in the Bahamas. There's the black and yellow-billed Amazon parrots living in the remote rainforest cockpit country of Jamaica. And then there's the yellow-shouldered Amazon parrot living in various sub-specific forms across the Dutch Antilles, as well as on the mainland of South America. And then in the Lesser Antilles, we have the majestic imperial parrot living on Dominica, the biggest Amazon parrot of all, a great chunky purple and green bird. And in the same island, the red-necked parrot. And then on the neighbouring Windward Islands of St. Vincent and St. Lucia, 2 more unique endemic Amazon parrots. And then the scarcest of all, the Puerto Rican parrot, down to just a handful of birds. Only one of them was only vulnerable to extinction, and that was the Hispaniolan parrot that was doing slightly better. The pressures that had caused these birds to decline down into populations that were literally in the handful was a combination of forces, and many of you will be familiar with them, and perhaps the most fundamental began in 1492 with the arrival of European ships off the coast of Hispaniola, and Christopher Columbus then laying the trail for adventurers from England, from France, and more from Spain to come in search of natural resources to begin with. First of all, they plundered the forest for timber. Vast quantities of mahogany extracted for shipbuilding and for building of towns, and indeed much of that mahogany you can still see today across stately homes and palaces in Europe where those luxury timbers were taken for those purposes. The local populations were enslaved, their land was taken, and once the timber had gone, so plantations were established, coffee, sugar, and to an extent cocoa established to feed markets on the eastern side of the Atlantic. By the time of the French Revolution, would you believe, most of the tropical rainforest across those islands had gone. And indeed, on the island of Cuba, there was only about 5% of the forest left by 1900. And of course, this deforestation was accompanied by a spate of extinctions. Many single island endemics were lost very quickly. The Hispaniolan monkey, the Hispaniolan edible rat, and an endemic woodcock on Hispaniola all disappeared very quickly. On Cuba, a flightless crane was lost, never to be seen again. And on Jamaica, the unique monkey and ibis that once lived there went as well. And although some of the parrots I was working on survived into the 20th century, quite a lot didn't. There used to be Amazon parrots on Guadeloupe and Martinique. We know nothing of those. We have a few drawings only. There was a beautiful red macaw that once lived on Jamaica, now gone. We only have one picture of that. There was a gorgeous macaw that lived on Cuba, went in the 19th century, and the Lesser Antillean macaw we know just from a few words written in a few books by some early travellers. And then on top of the deforestation, people were hunting the local wildlife. Some of it came back as pets, and indeed Christopher Columbus on his first voyage back to Spain brought with him Hispaniolan parrots to the Spanish court. People thought these were amazing and they wanted more of them. So people went back for more. And not only did they take live birds, they shot and hunted the local wildlife. And once the islands that might have just been subject to very light hunting pressure with arrows and spears were now subject to hunting with muskets and then shotguns and finally rifles, leading to the wildlife to be decimated. But of course, it was the fellow travellers that came with the Europeans, their monkeys, rats, dogs, cats and pigs, that caused particular devastation amongst the native wildlife. And indeed, the very fact of this release of these generalist aggressive predators caused possibly the biggest impact of all on island endemics, and not just in the Caribbean, but across the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And indeed, the Polynesian rat possibly is the species more responsible for extinctions than any other as a result of it travelling with people across the remote islands of the Pacific Ocean. The very emblem of extinction, the dodo, of course, is the result of a combination of these factors: deforestation, then hunting, but the coup de grace being delivered by pigs being dropped off by sailors so they could get pork on their next voyage by picking up animals that had reproduced in the forest. And of course, the loss of these great big curious animals like the giant pigeon, the dodo, or some of these monkeys and cranes and macaws, this is the tip of a far bigger iceberg that of course we will never know the size of, because we never properly documented what was on these islands before we set off the animals and plants on their short journeys to oblivion. So the documented loss of life on land has been very considerable. There's still a lot left, but also we're beginning to understand now the impacts in the water around islands. Many of those islands of the Caribbean, of course, were once fringed by beautiful coral reefs. Today, many of those are heavily degraded, and much of that has been linked with deforestation and the loss of soil from hillsides, followed by industrial pollution and sewage. And these are now being joined by an even bigger threat to island biodiversity in the form of climate change. And we see the effects of this now on coral reefs in particular as a result of warming, but also as a result of the effects of acidification. And we're also now seeing effects as a result of extreme weather. So the Puerto Rican parrot, that bird that was down to just a handful in the late 1980s, people managed to get it up to 56 birds recently in the forest. Fortunately, there's an insurance population in captivity. But when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in 2017, of the 56 birds that were living in the last piece of protected forest, just 2 survived. Dominica was hit by the same storm, possibly the biggest in the island's history, leading to large-scale deforestation. And then a couple of weeks ago, we had Hurricane Dorian go through the Bahamas, hitting the islands of Gran Bajo and Inagua, both of which are vitally important for that subspecies of Bahamian parrot. These birds, of course, have survived storms in the past, but the very fact that their populations now are so much more depleted and other pressures are taking such a toll, of course, it does leave them unable really to withstand these kinds of shocks. And at this point, as we look at the resilience of wildlife populations, it's very important to mention that something like 10% of the world's human populations also live in islands. And of course, the extent to which their futures are now bound up with that of the wildlife is becoming increasingly clear as we face the effects of environmental degradation locally, now coupled with global change. Take the effects of Hurricane Matthew that went through the Caribbean in October 2016. This island formed up off the storm formed up across the north coast of South America, travelled through the islands of the southern Caribbean to hit Haiti in early October, delivering a Category 4 storm slamming into the island, delivering a metre of rainfall, 145-mile-an-hour winds. Haiti, of course, is a very poor country, making it uniquely vulnerable. It was made more vulnerable still by the fact that nearly all of the forest had gone, 98% of it leaving bare hillsides, and those hillsides, the soils have been damaged by years of unsustainable agriculture. On the coast, the mangrove forest that once fringed the island had been removed to produce firewood, leaving the place naked in the face of this incredibly powerful storm. The low pressure and high winds caused a tidal surge to run inland, and the hillsides lost their soil with rocks and material crashing down into the valleys and into people's homes. About 1,000 people tragically lost their lives. And one wonders to what extent that was made worse by the environmental degradation that is so evident in that country and others. And we know that the hillsides clothed with trees hold water into the hills for longer, and we know that mangroves from other studies in different parts of the world do protect coastal communities from these kinds of extreme events, providing some level of protection that is far more effective than trying to replace those systems with concrete. And so we find that these effects are already becoming evident, combining the damage that's been done to terrestrial ecosystems. And as was mentioned a second ago, we had this week the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warning us now to expect up to 1 metre of sea level rise during the course of the coming century. And of course, this will not only lead to areas being inundated, but will make the effects of severe weather more serious still as tidal surges go further inland and the effects of serious hurricanes become more deadly than they are even today. And so in the face of this, it's becoming very evident that we need to bend the emissions curve back to zero very quickly and to be reducing the source of the problem in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. But of course, this is something that needs to be accompanied by a radical program of adaptation as well. And that adaptation, many people now can see, is going to be most effectively and most cost-effectively achieved through what we might regard as nature-based solutions. Reforestation, the restoration of coral reefs in shallow water, the recovery of mangrove forests in order to be able to provide flexible and self-adjusting sea defences on the one side, whilst giving some level of protection from the hills through putting back ecosystems that have disappeared over centuries. I've been very encouraged over recent years to see a new dialogue emerging amongst many small island countries around this idea of blue economies and moving towards an economy that is predicated on the recovery and restoration and sustainable use of the natural environment, rather than the old approach whereby the economy was really sacrificing the environment in order to achieve short-term economic growth. So taking a more joined up, more integrated view, and not only having a blue economy in the sea, but also a related green economy on land, recovering the natural environment for the protection of people, at the same time as opening new economic opportunities. And for example, tourism in the future is going to be a growth area for many islands, and those that have healthy wildlife populations, beautiful coral reefs and wonderful forests are going to be the ones that probably will secure the longer term benefits. And similarly with investment in the natural environment, in the recovery of ecosystems that will enable bigger fish catches to be caught into the future. All of these things, it can be seen, make sense in terms of investing in the environment now for gains into the future. And also we're seeing some of the more targeted conservation interventions actually working too. I'm delighted to look back 30 years ago now and to see that the work we were doing at the International Council for Bird Preservation in the 80s to conserve those rare parrots, actually none of them have gone extinct. Even the Puerto Rican, which had that horrendous drop in population as a result of the storm, still people are able to release captive birds, but some of the others have been doing really rather well. The St. Lucian parrot and the St. Vincent parrot going from critically endangered. Now these birds are in recovery with healthy populations growing as a result of local public education programs, the recovery of the forest, sustainable agriculture, and some of that being linked to economic gain in the form of ecological tourists coming to those islands to see those birds. Closer to home, we've had some success on Lundy, where we've now finally managed to remove the black rat, which was such a problem for the breeding puffins there, and as a result of that, the puffin colonies are in recovery. And I'm delighted to know from my colleagues that the Lundy cabbage is in recovery too as a result of the control of rhododendrons. So we are finding that these interventions work, and so do marine protected areas, and the UK has been something of a leader on the global stage on this subject over recent times, calling for 30% of the ocean to be protected by 2030, and some of the pioneering decisions being taken by the British government, including very substantial marine protected areas around some of our dependent territories, including British Indian Ocean Territory, Pitcairn, which incidentally has an endemic parakeet, and Ascension Island, all of these showing the way forward, and indeed another 41 new marine conservation zones announced in England a few months ago, some of which are associated with islands. So I think we can paint a pretty vivid picture of the biological importance of these wonderful places, the extent to which they're uniquely vulnerable, but also the extent to which we can paint a very vivid picture of how there are benefits and opportunities for people in the recovery of wildlife and ecosystems in these wonderful island environments. And we can see increasingly that the welfare of wildlife and the welfare of people can be put together as part of the same plan, and we're seeing increasing political will to go in that direction, which is very encouraging. And I do hope, as I said earlier on, that this Wilder Islands conference can give us a little bit more of a boost and impetus towards realising some of those win-wins, because whilst the risks and challenges are huge, the opportunities are bigger still. Thank you very much indeed.